The most dangerous secret a powerful man can keep is not an enemy. It's the moment he realizes someone ordinary has become impossible to lose. At exactly 2:17 a.m., every light inside the Castellano estate had gone dark except for one. A single lamp glowed behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of Adrian Castellano's private study, casting a warm circle of light across polished walnut floors and shelves lined with leather-bound books no one ever touched. The city beyond the glass shimmered beneath a blanket of midnight rain, its skyline blurred into silver streaks by droplets sliding slowly down the windows. Adrian stood perfectly still with one hand resting inside his pocket, his tailored charcoal suit as immaculate as it had been 16 hours earlier. His staff believed he had finally gone upstairs to sleep. His security team assumed he was reviewing tomorrow's meetings. Even the men who had worked beside him for years would never have guessed the truth. He was waiting for someone. Not a senator. Not a business partner. Not an attorney carrying contracts worth millions of dollars. He was waiting for the maid. Adrian glanced once more at the antique grandfather clock standing near the fireplace. The brass pendulum swung with relentless precision. 2:17 became 2:18. Then 2:19. She had never been this late before. 3 years. 3 years of predictable routines. 3 years of hearing the quiet sound of Naomi Carter humming old gospel melodies while arranging fresh flowers every Tuesday morning. 3 years of finding his favorite coffee already waiting on his desk before sunrise without ever asking for it. 3 years of pretending he barely noticed the woman who somehow managed to make a mansion built of marble and silence feel strangely alive. Yet over the last 2 weeks, something had changed. Naomi had started leaving immediately after dinner instead of reading in the staff lounge. She returned long after midnight, always apologizing softly to the night's supervisor before slipping upstairs without waking anyone. She smiled more than usual. She seemed lighter somehow, as though a private joy followed her home. Adrian had told himself. It was none of his concern. She was an employee. Her life belonged to her, not to the household she helped maintain. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he found himself noticing every missing detail. The kitchen lights stayed off because Naomi was no longer there preparing tomorrow's breakfast ingredients before bed. The piano in the family room remained silent because she was no longer practicing gentle melodies after finishing her work. Even the old golden retriever belonging to the groundskeeper wandered the hallway every evening before eventually lying beside the front entrance as though waiting for her footsteps. Adrian exhaled slowly. He disliked change. He disliked uncertainty even more. A pair of headlights suddenly appeared beyond the iron gates, their beams sweeping across the rain-soaked driveway. His pulse tightened before reason could silence it. The black sedan rolled toward the mansion with deliberate calm before stopping beneath the covered entrance. Adrian remained hidden behind the glass. He told himself he was merely confirming that every member of his staff had returned safely. Nothing more. The passenger door opened first. Naomi stepped out carefully, holding the edge of her navy raincoat close against the wind. Her natural curls were gathered beneath a dark scarf, and despite the late hour, exhaustion softened her usually bright eyes. Then another figure emerged from the driver's seat. A tall man wearing a light gray jacket hurried around the front of the car, carrying a folded umbrella. He opened it above Naomi before either of them could be caught in the rain. Adrian watched as the stranger smiled. Naomi smiled back. Not the polite smile she offered guests. Not the grateful smile she gave elderly neighbors. This one was quiet, comfortable, familiar. The man handed her a small paper bag. She laughed softly, shook her head as though protesting something playful, then accepted it with both hands. They exchanged a few final words that disappeared beneath the rain before Naomi gave a grateful nod. The man waited until she reached the mansion steps before returning to his car. Adrian did not move. His reflection stared back at him. From the dark window, composed on the outside, strangely unsettled beneath the surface. He had negotiated impossible deals without losing sleep. He had faced betrayal without raising his voice. Yet the simple sight of another man opening a car door for Naomi Carter unsettled him in ways he could neither explain nor control. Somewhere inside the enormous house, the front door opened with its familiar quiet click. Naomi was home. For the first time in 3 years, Adrian realized he no longer knew where she had been. And for the first time in his carefully ordered life, that uncertainty frightened him far more than he was willing to admit. 3 years earlier, Naomi Carter had arrived at the Castellano estate carrying a single navy suitcase with worn wheels and a folder that contained references from families who described her with the same quiet sentence. She always leaves a place better than she found it. The mansion itself had seemed impossible, stretching across nearly 5 acres of carefully maintained gardens, limestone walkways, and towering oak trees that had stood there longer than anyone still living. Naomi remembered standing at the front gate during her first morning, wondering how someone who had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago had somehow ended up working inside a place that looked more like a museum than a home. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the estate manager, welcomed her with calm professionalism and explained the rules that every employee respected without question. Arrive on time. Protect the family's privacy. Never enter the private study unless invited. Never interrupt Mr. Adrian Castellano while he was working. Naomi nodded politely, promising she understood every instruction. What no handbook explained was the strange silence that filled the mansion. Despite its beauty, the house felt empty. Staff members spoke only when necessary. Meals were prepared with perfect precision, but rarely shared. Fresh flowers decorated every hallway, yet no one ever paused to admire them. Adrian Castellano moved through the estate with quiet discipline, acknowledging employees with brief nods before disappearing into meetings, phone calls, and endless responsibilities. During her first week, Naomi decided that if she could not change the size of the house, perhaps she could change the feeling inside it. She began placing fresh flowers where morning sunlight reached the windows first. She learned that the elderly gardener preferred cinnamon rolls on Fridays, so she quietly left one beside his coffee before sunrise. When one of the younger kitchen assistants became overwhelmed preparing a holiday dinner, Naomi stayed 2 extra hours without mentioning it to anyone. Little by little, smiles appeared more often than before. Conversations lasted a little longer. Even the security guards found themselves laughing during late evening coffee breaks, because Naomi somehow remembered every birthday and every child's name. Adrian noticed every change, although he never admitted it aloud. He noticed that employees no longer rushed home the moment their shifts ended. He noticed that fresh flowers somehow lasted longer because Naomi rotated them between sunny and shaded rooms throughout the day. He noticed that the old golden retriever had stopped sleeping outside the garage and instead waited every morning beside the kitchen entrance for Naomi to arrive with his favorite homemade biscuits. Most surprising of all, he noticed that the mansion no longer felt like a building maintained by employees. It felt like a home cared for by someone who believed every ordinary kindness mattered. Still, Adrian maintained the careful distance he believed necessary. When Naomi served coffee, he thanked her with nothing more than a quiet nod. When she stayed late helping prepare charity events hosted at the estate, he instructed accounting to include additional overtime without revealing who had authorized it. During one unusually cold December morning, he silently ordered maintenance to replace the aging heater inside the staff residence after overhearing Naomi mention that several rooms felt chilly before sunrise. She never knew the request had come from him. That invisible pattern continued month after month. Naomi offered kindness without expectation. Adrian answered with protection that remained hidden behind routine, decisions, and quiet instructions. Neither of them realized that the distance they carefully preserved was slowly becoming the very thing neither one would know how to cross. Morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling across the eastern gardens, washing the stone terraces in soft shades of gold. From the outside, the Castellano estate looked exactly as it always had, orderly, elegant, and untouched by uncertainty. Inside, however, invisible changes had already begun. Adrian found himself noticing Naomi long before she entered a room. He recognized the quiet rhythm of her footsteps in the hallway before dawn, the gentle sound of porcelain cups meeting polished countertops as she prepared breakfast, and even the faint melody she hummed while arranging white lilies in crystal vases. He never searched for those moments intentionally. They simply became part of the rhythm that quietly organized his days. If Naomi took an afternoon off, the mansion somehow felt larger and strangely colder. He told himself that efficiency depended on dependable employees. Nothing more. Naomi believed something entirely different. To her, Adrian Castellano existed in a world she could never enter. He was respected by everyone who crossed his path, surrounded by responsibilities she could barely imagine. She had learned that powerful people often carried invisible burdens, so she never expected warmth from him. His brief nod each morning, his calm thank you after dinner, and the occasional quiet question asking whether the staff needed additional supplies were more kindness than she had expected from someone with his position. She never noticed that every schedule somehow allowed her Sundays free after mentioning once that she attended church whenever possible. She assumed Mrs. Brooks had simply been generous. She never realized Adrian personally approved every staffing rotation before it reached the household office. During one rainy Thursday afternoon, Naomi accidentally dropped a stack of old accounting binders while dusting the library shelves. Papers scattered across the hardwood floor, and she immediately knelt to gather them before anyone noticed. Adrian entered the room moments later, stopping beside the doorway. Naomi apologized at once, embarrassed by the mess, expecting another reminder about being careful. Instead, Adrian quietly crouched beside her, collected several folders, and placed them neatly back into the box without saying a single critical word. Their hands almost reached the same document before both paused for the briefest moment. Naomi smiled politely and thanked him. Adrian simply nodded before carrying the heavy box to the desk himself. The entire exchange lasted less than 60 seconds, yet Mrs. Brooks watched from the hallway with raised eyebrows. In 3 years, she had never seen Adrian assist anyone with something so ordinary. That evening, she mentioned the moment to the head chef, who merely smiled before changing the subject. Staff members had begun noticing countless little things. Adrian always asked whether Naomi had already eaten before approving late meetings that required additional kitchen service. Whenever seasonal flowers arrived, he somehow selected the varieties Naomi once mentioned, reminding her of her grandmother's garden. If maintenance repaired equipment inside the staff residence, Naomi's room was quietly completed first. None of those gestures appeared extraordinary by themselves, yet together they painted a picture Adrian stubbornly refused to see. Naomi remained completely unaware. She interpreted every thoughtful decision as evidence that her employer respected the entire household equally. The possibility that any of it might have been personal never crossed her mind, because she had spent her entire adult life believing that women like her were appreciated for their work, not remembered after it was finished. While Adrian carefully hid his growing affection behind routine decisions and quiet professionalism, Naomi was already planning a future that no longer included the estate. Every evening after finishing her duties, she opened a small notebook inside her room, reviewed handwritten goals, and calculated how much longer it might take before she could finally begin the next chapter of her life. She smiled each time the numbers came a little closer, never realizing that the life she hoped to build away from the mansion was slowly becoming the one thing Adrian feared most. The changes were so small that no one would have noticed them if they had not happened night after night. Naomi still completed every task with the same quiet care that had earned everyone's trust. The silverware still gleamed before every dinner. Fresh flowers still greeted guests in every hallway. The library still carried the comforting scent of cedar and polished wood every morning after she finished dusting. Only one thing was different. When her workday ended, Naomi no longer remained inside the estate. She changed into a simple navy coat, tucked a worn notebook into her shoulder bag, thanked whoever happened to be working the evening shift, and disappeared through the front gate just before sunset. At first, no one thought much about it. Everyone deserved a personal life. But then she began returning later and later. 9:30 became 10:15. 10:15 became nearly midnight. On several evenings, the grandfather clock had already chimed 12 before the quiet sound of her key reached the staff entrance. She always walked in with tired eyes, yet carried the same peaceful smile. She apologized for the late hour, wished the overnight staff a pleasant evening, and quietly climbed the stairs to her room. She never offered explanations because no one asked, at least not openly. Quiet conversations began during coffee breaks in the kitchen. The head chef wondered whether Naomi had started taking evening classes. One of the gardeners guessed she might have found a second job to save more money. 2 younger housekeepers exchanged knowing smiles and whispered that perhaps someone special had entered her life. Mrs. Brooks gently reminded everyone that another employee's private life deserved respect, and the conversations quickly faded whenever she entered the room. Even so, curiosity lingered in the air like the scent of fresh bread after breakfast. Adrian heard none of those discussions directly, yet he sensed the change without anyone speaking a word. Every evening, he found himself glancing toward the long driveway while finishing reports in his study. Every unfamiliar pair of headlights made him look up from the papers scattered across his desk. He disliked the habit immediately. It disrupted his concentration. More importantly, it exposed a question he refused to ask himself. Why did her schedule matter so much? One Thursday evening, he finally broke his own routine. As Naomi prepared to leave, Adrian happened to be crossing the main foyer. She smiled politely, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," she said warmly. "I hope you have a restful night." Adrian hesitated for only a second. "Will you be back very late?" The question surprised both of them. Naomi blinked before answering with her usual gentle honesty. "Probably a little after 11, sir. I am sorry if that causes any inconvenience." Adrian immediately regretted asking. "It does not," he replied evenly. "Travel safely." Naomi thanked him with the same grateful smile she always wore and disappeared beyond the front doors. Adrian remained standing in the foyer long after the sound of her footsteps had faded. Mrs. Brooks happened to walk past carrying a folder of household invoices. She noticed him looking toward the empty driveway and quietly continued on without interrupting. Experience had taught her that some truths revealed themselves only when people were finally ready to face them. That night, Adrian attempted to finish 3 important contracts waiting on his desk. He read the same paragraph 4 times without remembering a single sentence. At exactly 11:23, security cameras confirmed Naomi had returned safely. Only then did he close the folder, switch off the lamp in his study, and walk upstairs. He told himself he had simply been making certain every member of his household was safe. Yet deep inside, another truth had already begun taking shape. One that became harder to ignore. Each evening Naomi walked through those gates with a smile that seemed to belong to a world where he was no longer present. The following week settled into a pattern that Adrian could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Every evening, just before the sun slipped behind the tall oak trees surrounding the estate, Naomi exchanged her housekeeping uniform for the same navy coat, picked up her shoulder bag, and quietly wished everyone a pleasant evening before leaving through the front entrance. She never looked rushed. She never appeared nervous. In fact, there was a quiet anticipation in her expression that had not been there before. It was subtle enough that most people overlooked it, but Adrian noticed every detail. He noticed that she checked the time more often during dinner preparations. He noticed that she carried her phone instead of leaving it inside her locker. Once, while arranging fresh flowers in the foyer, she glanced at a message on the screen and smiled to herself before slipping the phone back into her pocket. The smile lasted only a second, yet somehow it lingered in Adrian's thoughts for the rest of the day. He immediately became irritated with himself. He had spent years mastering discipline, refusing to let emotions interfere with judgment. Yet now his concentration fractured because one employee seemed unexpectedly happy. It made no sense. During an important meeting the following afternoon, one of his attorneys politely repeated a financial projection for the 3rd time after realizing Adrian had not been listening. That had never happened before. Later, while reviewing renovation plans for one of his commercial properties, he approved the wrong blueprint and only caught the mistake after his assistant quietly pointed it out. Even Mrs. Brooks noticed the difference when Adrian absent-mindedly walked into the dining room, carrying the folder he had intended to leave in his study. She had worked for the Castellano family for nearly 20 years and had never seen him appear distracted. The strange feeling only grew stronger on Friday evening. Adrian happened to be standing near the upstairs balcony overlooking the circular driveway when a silver sedan stopped outside the front gate. Naomi stepped through the entrance carrying her bag, and the same man Adrian had seen days earlier climbed out to greet her. From that distance, their conversation could not be heard. What Adrian could see was enough. The man handed Naomi a paper cup, probably coffee from a nearby cafe. She laughed, accepted it with both hands, and thanked him warmly. They stood talking for another minute before Naomi climbed into the passenger seat. The car disappeared beyond the gates, leaving the driveway silent once again. Adrian remained motionless. He did not know the man's name. He did not know where they were going. His imagination quietly filled every unanswered question with possibilities he disliked more than he cared to admit. Perhaps Naomi had finally met someone who appreciated her kindness the way she deserved. Perhaps she had been quietly building a new life beyond the estate for months. Perhaps the notebook she reviewed every evening contained plans that no longer included returning after work at all. The realization landed with unexpected weight. If she left permanently, someone else would eventually polish the silver, arrange the flowers, and prepare the morning coffee. The mansion would continue operating exactly as it always had. Everything would function perfectly. Everything except him. For the first time, Adrian allowed himself to consider a truth he had carefully avoided for 3 years. He was not afraid of replacing an employee. He was afraid of losing Naomi. That thought lingered long after midnight, refusing to disappear no matter how many logical explanations he offered himself. By sunrise, one decision had quietly taken shape. Adrian would find out where Naomi went every evening, not because he wished to control her choices, but because uncertainty had become heavier than the truth, whatever that truth might be. Adrian did not believe in making decisions based on assumptions. That principle had guided every important choice of his adult life, and he refused to abandon it now simply because his emotions had become unexpectedly complicated. Early Monday evening, after Naomi quietly left the estate as she had every night for nearly 3 weeks, Adrian instructed his longtime driver, Daniel, to follow at a respectful distance. There would be no interruptions, no confrontations, and certainly no invasion of her privacy beyond understanding where she spent the hours that had slowly transformed his peaceful routine into restless uncertainty. The black sedan remained several blocks behind as Naomi boarded a city bus instead of meeting the silver car. Adrian frowned slightly. That was not what he expected. 25 minutes later, Naomi stepped off near a children's medical center on the north side of the city. She crossed the street carrying the familiar shoulder bag before entering through the hospital's volunteer entrance. Adrian remained inside the vehicle, confused. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he quietly walked into the lobby himself. Families filled the waiting area, some holding paper cups of coffee while others sat beside sleeping children wrapped in colorful blankets. A volunteer coordinator greeted Adrian with a polite smile, assuming he was visiting a patient. Before he could respond, laughter drifted from the pediatric activity room down the hallway. He instinctively turned toward the sound. Through the large glass window, he saw Naomi sitting on the floor surrounded by children wearing bright hospital wristbands. A little boy proudly held up a drawing while Naomi applauded as though he had painted a masterpiece. A young girl carefully placed a paper crown on Naomi's head, causing the entire room to burst into giggles. The woman Adrian had believed was secretly building a new romance was instead spending every evening comforting children who had spent their days surrounded by doctors, treatments, and uncertainty. Moments later, the same man from the silver sedan entered carrying several boxes of art supplies. Adrian immediately recognized him. He wore hospital identification around his neck. He was not a mysterious admirer. He was Dr. Ethan Brooks, the pediatric specialist leading the volunteer program. Ethan greeted Naomi with the easy familiarity of trusted coworkers before helping distribute crayons, books, and puzzles to the children. Their smiles carried no hidden romance, only shared purpose. Adrian felt an unexpected wave of embarrassment settle over him. Every conclusion he had reached over the past several weeks quietly dissolved. Curious, he approached the volunteer coordinator and asked how long Naomi had been helping there. The woman smiled warmly. Almost every evening for 6 months, she replied. She finishes work, comes straight here, and stays until we close. She also uses her own money to bring books and craft supplies whenever she can. The children absolutely adore her. Adrian remained silent. 6 months. While he had been convincing himself she was drifting away from the estate, Naomi had been giving away the few free hours she had to children who simply needed kindness after difficult days. As he watched through the window once more, one little girl wrapped both arms around Naomi before handing her a handmade card covered in colorful hearts and uneven handwriting. Naomi accepted it carefully, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion. Adrian suddenly understood the paper bag, the late nights, the peaceful smile she carried home, and the notebook she guarded so closely. None of it had ever been about escaping the life she had. It had been about quietly sharing that life with people who needed hope. Standing alone in the softly lit hallway, Adrian realized something far more humbling than jealousy. The woman he believed he had been protecting for 3 years had been changing lives every evening without asking anyone for recognition, and somehow she had never thought to tell him because she never expected praise in return. Adrian returned to the estate long after midnight, yet the mansion no longer felt familiar. Every polished hallway reminded him of moments he had misunderstood. Every vase filled with fresh flowers reminded him of the woman who had quietly carried hope beyond those walls while he remained trapped inside assumptions of his own making. He slept very little. Before sunrise, he found himself standing in the kitchen instead of his study. The room was empty except for the gentle sound of the coffee machine beginning its morning cycle. A few minutes later, Naomi entered wearing her usual housekeeping uniform, her natural curls neatly tied back beneath a simple scarf. She looked slightly tired after another late evening at the hospital, but her warm smile appeared the moment she noticed him. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano," she said. "Your coffee will be ready in just a moment." Adrian looked at her for several quiet seconds before answering. "Thank you, Naomi." His voice carried an unfamiliar softness that caused her to pause. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked kindly. Adrian almost asked where she had been the night before. He almost admitted that he now knew about the children, the drawings, the paper crowns, and the countless evenings she had given away without expecting recognition. Instead, he simply nodded. "Everything is fine." Naomi smiled again before preparing breakfast exactly as she always had. Yet Adrian noticed details he had overlooked for years. He saw the faint circles beneath her eyes from sleeping only a few hours each night. He noticed that the sleeves of her sweater had been carefully stitched where the fabric had begun to wear thin. He realized her shoes, though polished and clean, had been repaired more than once instead of replaced. She spent her own money bringing books and art supplies to children, yet never purchased anything unnecessary for herself. That realization stayed with him throughout the day. Later that afternoon, Adrian quietly invited Mrs. Brooks into his office. "Has Naomi ever asked for additional compensation?" he asked. Mrs. Brooks looked surprised. "Never, sir. In fact, she usually declines overtime unless another employee truly needs help. She says everyone deserves time with their families." Adrian lowered his eyes toward the papers on his desk. "Has she ever spoken about the hospital?" Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. "Only once. She said children should never have to face difficult days believing the world forgot them. She asked whether adjusting her evening schedule would inconvenience the household. I told her we would make it work." Adrian leaned back in silence after Mrs. Brooks left. The truth settled heavily in his heart. Naomi had never hidden her kindness. He simply had never thought to ask where she spent the hours beyond his carefully organized world. That evening, as the sun dipped below the gardens once again, Naomi prepared to leave for the hospital. She reached the front entrance before hearing Adrian's calm voice behind her. "Naomi." She turned immediately. "Yes, sir." Adrian walked toward her with measured steps before handing her a medium-sized shopping bag bearing the logo of a local bookstore. Naomi looked at him with quiet confusion. "I noticed the children's shelves at the hospital could probably use a few more stories," he said. "I thought perhaps these might help." Naomi slowly opened the bag. Inside were beautifully illustrated books, coloring sets, puzzles, and stacks of brand-new sketch pads. For a long moment, she could not find words. Her eyes shimmered with grateful surprise before she finally whispered, "How did you know?" Adrian offered the smallest smile she had ever seen from him. "Sometimes," he answered gently, "people deserve to know they are not carrying kindness alone." As Naomi held the bag close to her heart, Adrian realized the feeling growing inside him was no longer uncertainty or jealousy. It was admiration so deep that silence could no longer protect him from it. And for the first time in years, the distance between them no longer felt impossible. Naomi arrived at the Children's Medical Center carrying the bookstore bag carefully against her chest, as though it contained something priceless. The moment she stepped into the activity room, excited voices echoed across the brightly painted walls. Several children ran toward her, eager to discover what she had brought. One little girl carefully lifted a picture book covered with colorful woodland animals and hugged it tightly, before finding a quiet corner to begin reading. Another child immediately opened the box of crayons and spread dozens of brilliant colors across the art table. Dr. Ethan Brooks looked around the room with genuine amazement. "You did not have to do all of this," he said with a grateful smile. Naomi gently shook her head. "I did not," she replied softly. "Someone else did." Ethan glanced at the carefully chosen collection of books and puzzles. "Then whoever helped understands exactly what these children need." Naomi smiled without answering. For the first time in weeks, she found herself thinking about Adrian throughout the evening. She could not understand how he had discovered the truth she had never shared with anyone at the estate. More importantly, she could not understand why his quiet gesture had touched her heart so deeply. It was not the value of the gifts that stayed with her. It was the fact that someone had noticed the work she had always believed was invisible. Back at the mansion, Adrian remained in his study, but contracts and financial reports no longer held his attention. Instead, he opened his calendar and quietly canceled 2 upcoming social events that had never truly mattered to him. The following morning, he asked his foundation director to prepare a list of pediatric literacy programs throughout the city. He also requested information about volunteer initiatives that supported families facing long hospital stays. No public announcement was made. No photographers were invited. Adrian wanted the effort to remain exactly what Naomi had unknowingly taught him kindness should be: quiet, sincere, and focused on people rather than recognition. Several days later, Naomi was preparing fresh flowers in the music room when Mrs. Brooks entered carrying a sealed envelope. "This arrived for you," she said with a curious smile. Naomi opened it carefully and found a handwritten note from the Children's Medical Center thanking her for the unexpected donation of books, educational games, comfortable reading chairs, and a year-long commitment to expand the activity library. Her eyes widened in confusion because she had never made such a promise. Before she could ask another question, she noticed a familiar signature at the bottom of the accompanying letter: Adrian Castellano Family Foundation. Naomi stood completely still. The small bookstore bag had somehow become something far greater than she had imagined. That evening, she quietly knocked on the door of Adrian's study. He looked up from his desk and immediately recognized the letter resting in her hands. "I wanted to thank you," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those children will never know your name, but they will remember how today felt." Adrian slowly stood and walked toward the window overlooking the gardens glowing beneath the setting sun. "That is enough for me," he answered. Naomi looked at him with new understanding. The distance that had always existed between employer and employee suddenly felt less defined, replaced by a quiet respect that neither wealth nor position could create. In that peaceful silence, both of them sensed that something had changed forever. Neither one spoke the words resting in their hearts, yet neither needed to. Sometimes the deepest feelings begin not with grand declarations, but with two people discovering they have been walking toward the same purpose all along. The first Saturday of spring arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming magnolias across the Castellano estate. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the once quiet mansion with a warmth that seemed to reach every corner. The household staff moved through their usual routines, yet something had undeniably changed over the past several weeks. Laughter appeared more often in the kitchen. Fresh flowers seemed brighter in every hallway. Even Adrian found himself leaving the door to his study open instead of closing it behind him each morning. Shortly after breakfast, Naomi finished arranging a bouquet of white roses in the foyer when Mrs. Brooks approached with a smile. "Mr. Castellano would like to see you in the garden," she said. Naomi nodded, gently smoothing the sleeves of her uniform before stepping outside. Adrian was waiting beneath the oldest oak tree on the property, its wide branches casting shifting patterns of sunlight across the stone path. A small wooden bench overlooked the gardens Naomi had quietly cared for every season since arriving 3 years earlier. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Birds sang somewhere beyond the fountain, and the breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Adrian finally broke the silence. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." Naomi listened quietly, her kind eyes never leaving his face. "For years, I convinced myself that keeping my distance was the right thing to do," Adrian continued. "I believed that remaining silent protected both of us. Then you began coming home later every evening, and I realized something I had refused to admit even to myself. I was not worried because you worked too much. I was afraid because I could not imagine this place without you in it. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the honesty she had never expected to hear. Adrian smiled gently, the guarded expression he had carried for years finally giving way to quiet sincerity. When I saw how you spent your evenings, I understood something even more important. You have been making the world better without asking anyone to notice. I admired your kindness long before I understood my own heart. Naomi looked back at him, her voice soft but steady. I never stayed because of the house, Adrian. I stayed because this became the first place where I felt my work mattered. You made me believe I belonged here, even when you never realized you were doing it. Adrian took one careful step closer, leaving enough space for her to feel comfortable while allowing every word to remain genuine. Then I hope you will allow me to spend the rest of my life making certain you never have to wonder whether you belong again. Tears shimmered in Naomi's eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of finally hearing the truth both of them had carried in silence for far too long. She reached out and gently took his hand. There were no grand promises, no dramatic declarations, only two people choosing honesty over fear. In the months that followed, Naomi continued visiting the Children's Medical Center several evenings each week, but she no longer carried those responsibilities alone. The Castellano Family Foundation expanded its support for pediatric education, staff members volunteered alongside her, and Adrian often visited quietly to read stories to children who eagerly gathered around his chair. At the estate, nothing about Naomi's kindness changed because kindness had never depended on recognition. What changed was that she no longer walked through the halls believing she was invisible. Every person in the household knew her value, but none understood it more deeply than the man who had once mistaken silence for strength. Standing together beneath the old oak tree, Adrian realized that the greatest victory in his life had never been earned through influence or success. It came the moment he found the courage to tell one extraordinary woman that she had quietly become the heart of his home. And on that peaceful spring morning, the mansion remembered what it truly meant to feel alive.